So welcome everybody. This is the first session we're doing with our coach series. And I'm joined today by Grant Metcalfe-Smith. And Grant consults teachers and coaches in the field of sustainability. And I'm fascinated to understand his world. He works internationally in Asia and Europe and coaches a variety of different clients from graduates to executive level. And as a coach, Grant challenges his clients to think more deeply and creatively about their role as a leader and what that means within the sustainability ESG agenda. So Grant, welcome. It's a real pleasure to have you along.
Thanks for having me. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
If you wouldn't mind just sharing with our listeners your journey of where you've come from, your experiences and how you've ended up in the coaching world as of today.
Great. Yes, well, it's a pleasure to be here. So my background, yes, well, I'm Australian originally. I came here as a post-teenager and started a job in finance in London and worked here in banking for a long career and decided to look at coaching probably as a plan B about 4 years ago. And alongside my banking job, which was very full, I started to do coach training and at Henley Business School. So the segue into coaching really came about from me wanting a plan B as time moved on. My background has been, as I said, banking. I've worked internationally quite a lot. I've got a range of different clients from institutions through to companies. And but sustainability has been something that has been an abiding interest really in concert with the fact that the work I did in the last bank I worked for, its shift into green investments was very considerable. So alongside that, I was head of structuring advisory for a particular area. I got involved in doing a lot of the work on vetting these green investments. So that sort of piqued my interest in this whole broader sustainability space.
Yeah, nice. And you talk about the sustainability space, and I guess our listeners will be interested in what we actually mean by coaching sustainability in the sustainability space. So it'd be useful to sort of help our listeners understand what your perspective is on that. And if I may, I'll ask questions so I can clarify my understanding too.
Yes, exactly. So what we're not talking about is the sustainability of coaching, which again, I've seen some articles and discussions around, is coaching sustainable? What we're talking about today is really about the whole movement, if you want to call it a movement, of sustainability, which there's many definitions of what sustainability is, but you could easily say something that's sustainable is something that is balanced. And in the context of sustainability internationally, we're talking about looking at balancing economic viability of something, a project or a business, with social equity and with the protection of the environment. This balance between these three factors could be a good general working definition of sustainability.
Okay, great. And I've sometimes heard sort of that sustainability put into people, planet and profit. So organizations are looking at those three core areas for sustainability for all those stakeholders. Yes,
that's a perfect definition, actually. That really is a perfect one. So that my research was a bit shoddy.
No, that's fine. It's good to hear different perspectives. And just give me an understanding. I guess when you and I started to talk about this, that when I hear the word sustainability, you start then to think about that's sort of, you call it a movement. And as part of movement, there are activists. So how does coaching help to provide a better sustainable world that we want to live in without directing or being too active in trying to create a movement with an agenda?
That's a really good question, Trayton. A really good question. I think on the activist point, I mean, again, if you're looking at this, but as coaches, we know that we shouldn't be directive. We shouldn't be leading the client in the thinking process. However, you can, in my mind, you can facilitate through very good direct questioning. You can get someone to reflect on statements they've made or issues they've brought up around the particular goal they're looking at in the coaching session. So I think there's been, again, sustainability has come within the coaching context. I've certainly seen things such as the Climate Coaching Alliance, the CCA, which is a link in the show notes, which is being created about 3-4 years ago. It's international. I think the idea is to really try to develop a set of resources there to help coaches to deal and help their clients deal with the climate crisis in a variety of different ways. And that crisis can manifest itself through psychological distress, climate anxiety amongst individuals, or in fact, organizations who don't know how they're going to deal with it, or countries indeed who don't know how they're going to deal with it. Because a lot of this, as we know, adversely affects the low-income, middle-income countries. Climate change is really affecting the poorest nations. So the role of coaches, I think, en masse, I think is a really interesting idea. So a collective of coaches to actually to have a position with respect to, say, climate, I think is really empowering. So I don't know whether that answers part of your question, because it's a big question.
Yeah, no, it's a big question. Let's explore it further, because as you say, it's big and there's lots of parts to that. What I pick up in what you've just said there is fascinating, because I hadn't thought until you mentioned it that everybody's going to be impacted, irrelevant of their views, by sustainability, by the environment, people, planet, profit. And some will be comfortable with what they hear and see, and others will be less comfortable. And as you say, distressed by that. So is the coaching helping people to not only manage their thoughts, but also help them to clarify their views and their position with the things they're hearing or seeing?
Yes, that's right. I think that my practical experience of this has been that working with ESG teams and sustainability officers, chief sustainability officers, some of the principal challenges they have, they're tasked with an agenda to make a company, a bank or a corporate, fit for purpose in terms of ESG ratings and standards, because their investors care very much that actually they're fit for the modern world.
Yeah.
So, but however, what I have seen, at least bilaterally with some of my clients, that actually they're suffering from the team, the ESG team, the chief sustainability officer, is they feel empowered, they have all of the knowledge, but they go to their stakeholders, whether that's executive management or the board, who are of different mindset, perhaps a different generation, and that could be stereotypical as well, I'm saying that. But essentially, what they're facing at the board level can be a great deal of scrutiny and skepticism about the whole ESG, the whole sustainability process. Do we need this? What impact is it going to have on our bottom line? How's this going to play out? What happens? So lots and lots of questions. So I have seen a real role for coaching in actually helping to support these people, again, depending on your view, and I'm a convert, if you want to call it a sort of that. I'm a convert of sustainability, and so I believe we all need to do something, and collectively we can do more. So I'm working with people to help to galvanize them to build and convince and to persuade their stakeholders to actually say, this isn't going away, it's getting worse. We know it's getting worse. We need to deal with this.
And that's really helpful to sort of bring it into that sort of context. And I guess what you're saying is some stakeholders will have a focus, and it's my experience as well of working at that C-suite level, will have a real focus on the profit of the business, the financial elements of it. And although they talk about that planet's important and people are important, at the end of the day, it's the profit that takes the priority. So what you're saying is, if I've heard you right, Grant, is about helping those ESG directors, executives, try to influence and develop a more balanced view across those three areas rather than just being profit orientated. And that's, I guess, a challenge for many.
You're right. And it absolutely is a huge challenge. It's massive because, again, every day you can read articles about my fiduciary responsibility is to look after the money. And you're telling me that this is a narrative of climate change, it's a narrative of whatever, even though you've got science behind the climate change, that people still think it's a narrative. So show me. And so I think that I think it's incredibly challenging to persuade people that are tasked and looking at the financials only to move the dial. So it's not a quick fix. I think it's something which you've got to do systemically. And I think that systemic coaching work, actually, we haven't touched on, but I think that type of work would lend itself very well because you're talking about looking at the constellation of different stakeholders in this whole, if you want, ecosystem of the organization to say, okay, am I against the world? The CSO, the chief sustainability, am I against the world? Or actually, who else have I got here that could be helpful for me with this agenda? Again, the irony being that CSO functions are still fairly new. I mean, they're not that many people have been doing it for a long period of time. So in some senses, I get also that they are finding their way. So yeah, it is a huge challenge, and I think it's going to get even more challenging because a lot of, particularly from say the US, you've got a lot of anti-ESG sustainability rhetoric, and particularly around this whole concept of my responsibility as a fund manager or a company is to make money for my investors. And you're telling me that the ESG, prove to me that it's worth my while financially to do it, then I will do it. Otherwise, it looks to me like it's pretty costly.
So it's constantly put through a lens of the profit or the financial element rather than the planet or people, is what you're saying.
I think so. I mean, again, it's difficult to generalize, but I think that again, these same people. So who was tasking the board and the executive management to make money? It's the shareholders, right? So it's the shareholders that, on one hand, have got to accept a lower return to say, okay, we understand this. We really buy and believe in this. We need to change things. So it always ultimately is the investors in your business that, whatever hat they wear, they've got to wear maybe more than just one hat, which is the financial hat. Yeah. And I think that the big challenge straight now is, of course, with economic growth as it is globally, there's a lot of economic headwinds. So people are desperate to make returns. I think it's considerable challenges on the sustainability agenda.
And I think it's interesting, the sustainability agenda, because my view, and this is only my personal view, is that for something to be sustainable, it can't just focus on the money. It's got to focus on people. It's got to focus on the planet. So the whole sustainability piece is about making sure we're here tomorrow to make money.
Yes, that's right. The whole essence of it is balance, right? Is trying to balance those three PPPs, as you said. And without imbalance, it's not sustainable, and therefore future generations clearly will be negatively impacted. But it's interesting also that having read, about trying to make climate. I mean, what is the rhetoric of climate change in terms of get people that really want to promote concern? A lot of psychological studies have kind of shown that people, it's too remote for them. And if it's too much of a polemic, too activist, then actually people shut down. I've got too much going on in my life. It's too much here. I believe what I believe. So I think there's a really critical line to walk for climate change activists. I mean, again, splashing a piece of artwork with paint is not a way to deal with it. I don't think.
Yeah. And I guess what you're saying, what I've picked up, there are sort of three key themes that we need to be conscious of. One is the balance of all those three things. There's also a sort of a timeline. What I'm picking up is that, we talk about sustainability being around for the longer time, being around always, so it's constantly going on. But we work in a world where it's quite instant, and people want, monthly, quarterly, annual targets to be hit, and those are mainly those financial piece. And the third element I'm picking up, which you mentioned, was around this generational, and the people that are at those sort of senior levels of one generation, and there's 5 generations, my understanding, within the workplace. So we've got all these different views. So trying to balance different views and different agendas is, another key element that I'm picking up from what you're saying. So those 3 points.
Absolutely, yes. I think that multi-generational one is particularly interesting. Whilst it's easy to stereotype the older generations being conservative and just caring about the money, I think within that cohort, there are people clearly that are concerned and committed to making some changes. But I think that, I guess, the negative things in your mind tend to stick out more, and you tend to remember those more. But I do hear from a number of people that the old guard, as it were, are really the problematic piece in the equation here, but they're the people that run the business. Yes, it's a very big challenge.
And I see that, it's interesting because I see that from let's say, a coaching culture perspective. And I'll use your language, if I may, Grant. The old guard have all developed through an environment where it's command and control. Yes. That's how you got success.
Yes.
Well, now the power's shifted and mindsets need to shift. And you've got people who want to be more collaborative and more connected and more empowered. So you've got these
Yes.
sort of, let's call them the old guard and the new guard for sake of argument. And there's this clash. And I think we're in a fascinating place within the world at the moment because of that transition that we're going through. And, COVID sort of helped to accelerate it, but I think it was going on there and it's brought it to the line where people go, actually, there is a different way of doing work. And actually, I have got the authority and power to do things myself and think for myself. And, I do have a view and I do want that work-life balance. So I think this whole sustainability piece is not just, as you say, about the planet. I think it's about how we operate and make ourselves sustainable in the way that we do work for enjoyment rather than just for the monetary value that will get us a salary or whatever, how we make our fees.
Yeah, yes, I agree. I think that I guess the younger generations are thinking in network terms, right? Whereas the older generation tend to, again, not everyone will, but will think more linearly, A to B. And I think that bridging that gap is challenging. And it'll be very interesting to see how this evolves in the next 5 or 10 years as this middle generation gets older, that are tech savvy, that are network based. They think in networks. They think differently to the older generation. So I think it's an interesting time, and I think that a lot of what I see also is a lot of the younger generations they're investors that they want impact on their investments as well, which is such the proliferation of impact investing, which again is clearly very related to this whole ESG. Whether you're buying a social bond or making a social loan that will actually have a return based upon social outcomes, or a green bond, which again is we know would need to go to green projects. So these sorts of things, the current generation is really thinking I really want my money to have some impact here. And I think that's very different from people. Yeah. Again, you can't generalize, but from other people that are chasing just the last 5 or 10. 0.05% on the next interest rate on switch to another bank. So I think this difference manifests itself right across the way they behave as well with their financial investments and the way they live.
Brilliant. I mean, that's really helpful to understand all of that world, and I guess how different generations will be looking at. And I guess from what you're saying, how the world is changing, not just in the investment world, but just generally in the world of work.
That's right. Absolutely. I mean, so much has changed, and COVID brought us many terrible things, but it also brought us a lot of benefits. It's fast-tracked the technology, the fact we're doing this comfortably, the fact that we work so hybridly. All these things I think are definitely good things, and they're not going away. So, but that control and command culture is set to be dealt some pretty deathly blows in the next 5 or 10 years. From everything, the whole culture landscape seems to be just changing. Going back on a previous point you made about activist coaches, whether there is a role for us to be activists, just thinking that I think there is a role for us to ask, as coaches, to ask very direct, insightful questions. I mean, that's the job of a coach, is to ask direct, insightful questions. But with respect to this whole sustainability space, if you sense that clients who may not be necessarily involved in that business, but are being affected by it, you can ask very direct questions about this, I think, without giving away what your own thoughts are. So I think there is a role for activism within ESG and sustainability without, I think, going into directive behavior.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, and I'm just like you, reflecting and processing that. And I think the way that I would see it if I was coaching is it's my role as a coach to raise the leader's understanding of reality in the context and the changing world around them, so that they can then be aware of that and make their own decisions. Yeah. So, in simple term, my role is to raise their awareness and to give them that understanding about choices that they might need to take or not, as the case may be. But the choice to do that is up to them. I guess when I hear the word activist, and this is the bit that for me, it isn't a coach's role, is to start pushing my agenda or my values or my beliefs around sustainability and ESG onto the coachee. For me, it's just about raising awareness of the changing environment, workplace that we're living in, and allowing that leader then to make choices or take options that they may have thought of themselves.
Yeah, I share your concerns. I think there probably is a spectrum of views on that within the coaching community, particularly within some of the organizations more targeted towards this area. I think that people may be using it perhaps a bit more likely, being a bit more directive. But yeah, you are right. I think people need to use coaches. I think to maintain the clarity of coaching, I think is incredibly important. I think if we start to dilute that into a political discussion or a whatever, then I think that it takes away the power of the coach, and it makes it very unclear. Well, what's your agenda here? So yes, but I think that I would imagine there are people that are using it. My belief is underlying to this, and that will come through, I guess, in their questioning and their suggestions.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. You mentioned the term CSO, which I'm going to assume means Chief Sustainability Officer.
I apologize. Yes, that's right.
Okay. Just clarify that for our listeners. So, and again, just for our listeners to understand, and you've worked with a number of CSOs and ESG officers. It'd be really useful to just give a flavour of some of the types of conversations, topics, challenges that come up. So if they do come up for our listeners when they're coaching, they've got a sort of flavour of what to expect, and maybe some approaches or thoughts of how you've then approached that.
Yeah, good question, Trayton. I think that the CSO ESG teams that I've worked with so far has been essentially, if you look at this as a sustainability as a project, is it fundamentally any different from any other project? I think that it is. I think it's more complex because of the ramifications of it to all of ourselves, potentially as people and future, our kids. I think it's quite easy for emotions to spill into this and to become quite dogmatic about this. So in general, the Chief Sustainability Officer, ESG teams, they have gone to that space because they believe in this whole initiative, if you want to call it an initiative. It's more than an initiative. It's a requirement in their mind. And so I guess that trying to deal with that and trying to recommend that actually, whilst you're passionate going into a board or an executive management team that are skeptical, don't quite understand what it's all about, I think it needs a really clear process of you to convince and to build over time, rather than just say, this is what we're going to be doing. So some of the themes that have come up have been literally talking about how can I be more impactful with my stakeholders. Yeah. And so you could apply the same coaching thought process as you could. I think that the complication is, I think, the emotion. I'm not saying that other challenges don't. We all respond. We're all emotional to different things. So, but I think that the feeling in someone's gut of, we really need to do this because it's very important. You've got to work with your coachees to suspend that in a way, to actually be able to say, listen, I hear what you're saying, but actually they're not listening. They're not listening. They may think you're lightweight, and some of the feedback I've had has been, from the other side. Well, this team is very passionate, very well researched, but a bit flaky and financially not up there, not rigorous financially. Yeah. And I think that so therefore you've got to coach not in a directive way to say, well, I think you need the following. But I think you need to have the CSO and their teams just think, actually, how am I coming across? How am I really coming across here? And I think that's something which is very common to the other coaching work that we do.
Yeah. I guess the difference, you're absolutely right. It's about, the impact I'm going to have. I guess here it's, as you say, it's sort of like a movement rather than an initiative. And you're trying to move people to become more balanced with their approach rather than just being profit orientated. Yes. And you're also fighting, I guess, when you're trying to make that impact, you're fighting against short-termism.
Yes.
And it's a way of being, sustainability, a bit like, a coaching culture is a way of coaching, is a way of being. So it's a sort of shift of mindset that you're trying to have that impact on the board, which will then hopefully, with that change of mindset, help them to make a more balanced view with the levels of sustainability and longevity with the decisions and the approach that they're creating.
Yeah, absolutely. The short, we know we live in a short-term time frame. That's how everything is hyper short now. It's we've got to do everything right now. But sustainability And many other initiatives are also, medium to very long term. There's nothing unique about sustainability, but it is certainly a very long term thing to transform a company that is, let's say, a polluter to transition that to something else takes a very long time. And particularly, depending where you are in the world, it will take a very long time to do that. And they need to have lots and lots of other things in place to be able to facilitate that as a process. But most of all, you need your stakeholders to say yes, because when you choose sustainability as a route, and your stakeholders need you to do it, your corporate strategy needs to reflect it. All of your annual reports, everything you need to create sustainability reports, all sorts of stuff here. So there's a lot of extra work involved for a company. There'll be teams for a large corporate or a large bank, teams and teams of people, new processes, new committees, and all of that, particularly in times of austerity, means that's extra money. Hang on, that's extra people. We've got people, our sales team or our marketing team, they need extra people, but and they're producing the profitability. You're asking me for another team that's not going to be profitable. Is another level of, we kind of view them as regulators, internal regulators. So you can see that kind of that profitability. I mean, the financial return is a perennial thing we keep on coming back to, because that is what a lot of people hung up about. Does this make sense? Are my peers doing it? Do I need to really do it? If I do, how much? And I think that a lot of the beneficiaries now that I see are the consultancies and so forth that are making a lot of money out of this transition process. But a lot of companies still got so much to do so far to develop, particularly in emerging markets, where they're just absolutely, and these are the worst affected companies that have got the actual the actual environmental and social inequity. I mean, we haven't talked much about the social, actually. We talk more about the environmental, but the social, this idea of, again, the other level of nuance there is that should a company really care about the social aspect, impact of its business? The answer seems to be, well, it should, but that's a big mindset change. I produce a widget, and now you're meant to say, I look at the upstream and the downstream from the widget production and care about the communities affected, the workers, the impact of technology on unemployment. So how am I meant to care for the world? And that's kind of what a lot of people are thinking.
Yeah, I guess where does it stop?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. So I guess what you're also saying, and I'm picking up, and you said this, you mentioned this word before again, but I want to clarify it for our listeners. It sounds like a lot of the work you do is quite systemic, in the sense that you're not only having to help that individual have an impact, but helping that individual understand how they can influence and create movement across a much wider stakeholder base. So things start to change, in lots of different areas, rather than just being very narrow focused in talking to the board. They're starting to hear different things, and people are demanding different things. And we talked about the generation. So this thing starts to get momentum, I guess, is what you're saying, and helping coaches, leaders to be able to build that momentum.
Yes, that's right. I tend to think systemically. The work I did as a banker, I worked for a development finance institution. So we were into projects which had very wide impact. So my preferred mode, my own personal preferred mode of thought is thinking quite wide, but actually zooming in to make specific impact where we can. And I think that mindset, I guess, comes through in my coaching as well, that I encourage people to think, listen here, this is the problem, but let's zoom out to what we're saying. Who are the players here? Because it is really that, and also the way that I worked as a banker was not in an investment bank context where it's cut and thrust and you're just on the profitability. It was actually the culture I came from was about influencing, about building consensus. And I think that those are the skills which a lot of CSOs and ESG teams, again, back to that point, could benefit from refining and developing in order to really build some strength and build a position, again, a positive position between themselves and their stakeholders. And again, back to your point, that takes time to possibly repair relationships. To once you're skeptical of someone, as human beings, it's quite hard to overcome that, right? So yeah, it's but all of this points to there's no quick fix for this.
No, sure. And as a coach, I'm curious as it's a sort of a long process, how do you manage when you're coaching in an organization to manage your impatience, to manage your emotions around these things where you want to get a quick fix, but actually you can't? And how do you stop that showing up within the conversations you have with your coaches?
Yes, I guess my own position is clear on where I stand on sustainability, right?
Yeah.
Slightly. It can be a challenge, particularly where you have people that are, kind of themselves unsure of what they should be doing. And so it's tempting as a coach to galvanize, to say, to dip into semi-directed behavior and say, listen, why don't you think about the following? Well, hang on, that's a leading question.
Sure.
What do you think? What do you think you need? I mean, so I think trying to zoom out to say, okay, this is not about me and mine. It's absolutely not about me and mine. It's about their perceptions, and it's helping them to get to where they want to get to. As involved as you may emotionally get in the conversation, I think that's a point as a coach to always remain, as much as we can, we're emotional beings, to remain fairly neutral on the personal, on the stakeholder stories that they tell, to say, okay, listen, there's a way to tackle this or address this. You've got to remove your emotions as a coach, because that's actually that's of no value to your client. It can be interesting, but it's a diversion.
Yeah, great. So Grant, it's been fascinating talking with you to hear about your perspective and your lens on sustainability and coaching sustainability. Time as ever has got the best of us. But before we go, I have this question which I ask all of my guests, and I think it's even more relevant for you because it talks about tomorrow. And our purpose at Coaching Focus is very simple. It's coaching for a better tomorrow. So I'd like to understand your perspective on what does coaching for a better tomorrow mean to you?
Coaching for a better tomorrow. That would be, I mean, that's intrinsic to what motivates me to, as a consultant, as a coach, is to actually, I believe that there is huge possibilities in all of us to help to co-develop a better tomorrow. So I think for me, it's about working together, working closely, and working with integrity to actually hopefully derive a better tomorrow.
Great. Well, Grant, listen, it's been a real pleasure to speak to you, and I'm sure most, if not all, of our listeners would agree with that sentiment. So thank you for your time, and here's to a better tomorrow.
Absolutely. Thank you, Trayton.